Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite a stack of sources here today. Looks like research and notes taking us on a pretty big tour through, well, centuries of economic thinking.
That's right. We're not just, listing names and dates. We're really tracing how the big ideas evolved, how people first thought about national wealth, how views on markets, money, government, how all that shifted over time.
Exactly. And our job here is to dig into this history, pull out the important stuff, the key takeaways, and figure out why these old debates actually still matter, why they echo in the headlines you see today.
Yeah, we're exploring some really fundamental questions about how economies are supposed to work.
And maybe what happens when they don't quite work as planned.
Should be fascinating. Okay, let's jump right in. The sources start us off with the mercantilists. What was their sort of core idea about what made a nation wealthy and strong?
Well, the material makes it pretty clear. They basically measured a country's power by how much gold and silver it had piled up, precious metals.
Right. So the main goal was just to get as much of that hoard as possible. And the primary way, sell more stuff to other countries than you buy from them. Always aim for that trade surplus.
So basically, export like mad, import as little as possible.
Exactly. But the sources point out a couple of big problems, almost inevitable flaws, that meant this couldn't really last forever.
Okay.
First, if you actually succeed in hoarding tons of gold and silver in your country, what happens? Your money supply shoots up.
Uh-huh.
And when there's more money chasing the same amount of goods, well, the value of money falls. You get inflation inside your own country.
Ah, okay. And the second reason?
Well, think about it. A policy built on one country constantly running a huge trade surplus means its trading partners have to be running deficits. They're essentially getting poorer.
Right, they're sending their gold to you.
Precisely. And eventually, your customers just can't afford to buy your stuff anymore. Trade kind of collapses. So their own success ended up causing internal problems with inflation and external problems by, well, bankrupting their trading partners.
Fascinating. So it was sort of doomed from the start, in a way.
In the long run, yeah. Seems that way.
So who came next to challenge this? The sources mention the Physiocrats.
The Physiocrats, yeah, they had a totally different take. They talk about a natural order in the economy.
Natural order.
They believed that if you just left individuals alone to pursue their own self-interest, this natural order would somehow guide things so that society as a whole would benefit the most. You didn't need, heavy government interference.
So the government should just step back, let it be.
That's pretty much their famous laissez-faire idea, just as the sources say. Literally, let do or let go. They genuinely thought problems like inflation or unemployment or trade imbalances would just sort themselves out naturally. And a really key part of this natural order for them was protecting private property rights. That was fundamental.
Okay, that idea of minimal government intervention, that feels like a clear link to the next big school, the classical economists. Our sources really dig into them. What's like the absolute cornerstone of classical thought?
Right away, the sources bring up Say's law. You often hear it boiled down to every supply creates its own demand.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit because honestly, it sounds kind of strange today. What did JB Say actually mean by that?
According to the material we have, the core idea is that when you produce something, that very act of production generates the income needed to buy other things of the same value.
Right.
It's not just about making stuff. It's about creating the means to purchase other stuff. Fundamentally, it's about swapping goods for goods, and money is just, a temporary lubricant in that process.
Like that tailor example in the notes. He makes a suit, sells it, and uses the money to buy bread and shoes. Supplying the suit is his demand for other goods.
Precisely. Everyone who brings something to market is doing two things at once. Trying to sell what they made, trying to buy other things they want, using the value of what they sold. So in the grand scheme of things, total supply and total demand have to be equal. The supply is the demand, in aggregate.
And that makes it very much a supply-side perspective, doesn't it? Focused on production, driving everything.
Yes, the sources definitely frame it that way. The economy's potential is all about its ability to produce, and demand just sort of tags along automatically. It's not that the demand is irrelevant,
Yeah.
but it wasn't seen as something that could be lacking for long periods. It's also definitely a long-term way of looking at things.
But, markets aren't always perfectly balanced in the real world. What did the classicals think ensured this equilibrium? How did it all balance out?
This is where the sources really stress the importance of flexible prices and wages. That's the key mechanism, the invisible hand, right?
Uh-huh.
If there's too much of something, the price falls, people buy more. Too little, the price rises. Producers make more. Markets clear automatically through these price signals.
Okay, what about the labor market? If you have unemployment, more people wanting jobs than jobs available.
The classical view, as laid out in the sources, was that wages would simply fall. Labor gets cheaper.
Right.
And as labor gets cheaper, businesses find it more attractive to hire more workers. So falling wages move the labor market back to equilibrium, where supply equals demand. Anyone still unemployed after that was considered voluntarily unemployed, meaning they just weren't willing to work for the going wage.
And what about saving? If people save a lot instead of spending, doesn't that break Say's law by reducing demand?
Good question. That's where the flexible interest rate comes in. It's another crucial adjustment mechanism.
Okay.
The sources explain that classical theory sees the interest rate as the reward for postponing your consumption. And interest rates are set in the market for loanable funds, where savers lend to borrowers, who are usually investors.
Got it.
So if savings go up, people are saving more than businesses want to invest, the supply of loanable funds increases. What happens? The price of borrowing, the interest rate, falls. Lower interest rates make borrowing cheaper, so businesses invest more. It also makes saving less attractive, so people might save a bit less. This pushes savings and investment back towards equality. So flexible interest rates ensure that savings don't just disappear from the demand side. They get channeled into investment spending. Savings were actually seen as essential for growth.
Okay, so the whole system relies on flexibility, prices, wages, interest rates, all adjusting automatically. What about money itself in this classical world?
Money was generally seen as, well, neutral, or like a veil, just covering the real exchanges happening underneath. Its main job was just to make transactions easier, a medium of exchange.
Right.
This leads to the classical dichotomy idea. Real things like how much stuff gets produced, output, or how many people have jobs, employment, are determined by real factors: technology, resources, effort. They're separate from nominal things like the overall price level or wages measured in dollars.
And this connects directly to the quantity theory of money, doesn't it? That MVPT equation.
Exactly. The sources lay it out clearly. In the classical view, V, the velocity of money, how fast it changes hands, and T, the volume of real transactions or output, were assumed to be pretty stable, at least in the short run. So if V and T are stable, the equation basically says any change in the money supply, M, causes a direct proportional change in the price level. P, double the money supply, you double the prices, that's it. Money doesn't really affect the real economy in the long run. And money demand was just for making purchases, not influenced by interest rates.
And the government's role in all this self-adjusting machinery.
Minimal, very minimal. The classical school favored a limited state. They were generally against government meddling, didn't like budget deficits, and thought government borrowing was a bad idea. Keep the budget small and balanced. That was the ideal.
Okay, moving on. Our sources talk about the neoclassical school sort of refining these classical ideas. What was one of the main shifts they brought?
Well, while they kept a lot of the classical framework, a really key difference was in the theory of value. The classicals often lean towards a labor theory of value. Something's value comes from the labor put into it.
Right.
The neoclassicals shifted to a utility value theory. Value comes from how useful or satisfying a good is to the consumer. It's subjective utility that matters.
Utility. So how much satisfaction you get from something.
Exactly. That put the individual consumer and their choices right at the center. It also led them to focus heavily on rational individuals making decisions at the margin, thinking about the benefit or cost of one extra unit of something to maximize their utility or profit.
And they still believed markets tended towards equilibrium.
Oh, absolutely. They actually developed much more sophisticated mathematical models for this, like Walras's general equilibrium analysis, trying to show how all markets could theoretically reach equilibrium simultaneously. And like the Physiocrats, they really emphasized that protecting private property rights was crucial for encouraging people to work, save, and invest.
How did they handle the quantity theory of money? Did that stick around?
It definitely remained central, but they developed it further. The sources lay out two main versions. First, there's the Fisher type, the exchange approach. That's basically the MVPT we just talked about.
Yeah.
Fisher really focused on the supply of money and how it flows, assuming V and T were stable to show that M directly impacts P. He also gave us that Fisher equation for interest rates. The nominal rate is the real rate plus expected inflation.
Okay. And the second version?
That's the Cambridge type, or the cash balance approach, developed by folks like Marshall and Pigou at Cambridge. Their equation looks a bit different, M, KPT, or sometimes KPY.
What's K?
Instead of velocity V, K represents the demand for money. It's the proportion of their income or transactions that people choose to hold as cash balances. You can think of K as basically the inverse of velocity. If people want to hold more cash relative to their spending, K is high. Then money isn't changing hands as fast, V is low.
Ah, so the Cambridge version focused more on why people hold money, not just how fast it circulates.
Exactly. And this is a subtle but important point the sources make. While their main focus was still money held for transactions, the Cambridge approach implicitly acknowledged money as a store of wealth too, something people might hold on to. This idea of holding money becomes really important later with Keynes.
Interesting.
But ultimately, even with these different formulations, both Fisher and Cambridge largely reached the same conclusion. In the long run, changes in the money supply mainly just change the price level. The economy still tends towards full employment. And because they assume this long-run equilibrium, the sources note neoclassicals tended to focus more on micro issues, individual choices, firm behavior.
Okay, now we get to a massive turning point, right? Prompted by the disaster of the Great Depression in 1929, our sources dive into the Keynesian Revolution. What was the big glaring problem that classical and neoclassical ideas just couldn't seem to explain about the Depression?
The sources make it really plain. The reality on the ground was persistent, devastatingly high unemployment. Total demand for goods and services was clearly way, way less than what the economy could produce.
Yeah.
Classical theory, with Say's law and those flexible wages and prices, said this shouldn't happen, or at least it should fix itself quickly. But it just didn't. The system wasn't self-correcting.
And John Maynard Keynes came along with a fundamentally different explanation.
He certainly did. The Keynesian school argues that, look, the economy does not automatically settle at full employment, and just relying on wages and prices to fall isn't enough to get it there, especially not in a deep slump. Their focus is very much short-term, what's happening now, how do we manage it? And it's driven by the demand side of the economy.
How did they view the labor market differently than the classicals?
Well, a key point the sources highlight is that Keynesians argued workers often care more about their nominal wage, the actual dollar amount, than their real wage, adjusted for prices.
Monetary illusion.
Exactly. People really resist a cut in their paycheck's dollar amount, much more than they resist their purchasing power falling a bit due to inflation. This stickiness in nominal wages means wages don't fall easily enough during a recession to clear the labor market and get back to full employment. Businesses, though, still care about the real cost of labor.
Okay. And interest rates. Classicals said it's the reward for saving.
Keynes had a very different and quite famous take, as the sources explain. He argued the interest rate is the price you pay for giving up liquidity. It's the reward you get for holding something less liquid, like a bond, instead of holding onto cold, hard cash.
And where did Keynes think interest rates were determined?
In the money market. It's where the supply of money meets the demand for money.
Okay, that's totally different from the classical view of savings and investment determining it in the goods market or loanable funds market.
Exactly. Keynes' theory here is called liquidity preference. He said people demand money for, well, 3 reasons. 1, transactions every day buying and selling. 2, precautionary motives having cash for unexpected emergencies. And 3, crucially, for speculation.
Ah, speculation. This is where it gets really interesting, right? Holding money just to speculate.
Yes, the idea is people might choose to just hold cash if they think interest rates are likely to go up soon. Why? Because if interest rates rise, the price of existing bonds falls.
Right.
So you might hold cash now, even though it earns little or no interest, hoping to buy those bonds cheaper later after rates have risen and prices have fallen. This means, unlike the classical view, the demand for money is sensitive to the interest rate. When rates are low, people are more willing to hold speculative cash balances. When rates are high, holding cash is less attractive compared to earning interest on bonds.
And this leads to that idea of the liquidity trap the sources mention.
Precisely. The sources explain this can happen when interest rates get pushed down to a very, very low level, maybe close to zero. At that point, pretty much everyone expects rates can only go up from there. So nobody wants to buy bonds because their price is expected to fall. People are essentially infinitely willing to just hold on to cash instead. The demand for money becomes extremely sensitive to any further small changes in the interest rate. Graphically, it becomes flat, horizontal.
And what does that mean for policy?
It means, as the sources note, that trying to stimulate the economy by just printing more money, monetary policy, becomes useless. The central bank pumps more money in, but people just hold it as idle cash. It doesn't push interest rates down any further. and so it doesn't encourage more borrowing or investment.
So given all this sticky wages, liquidity traps, what was the Keynesian view on the government's role?
Completely different from the classicals. Keynesians believed the government had to step in, especially during recessions. The main tool, fiscal policy, government spending, and taxes. The sources state clearly, Keynesians see fiscal policy as powerful and effective. Government spending directly adds to aggregate demand. They even use that a provocative example. If necessary, the government should borrow and spend, even on things like digging holes and filling them up again. The point wasn't the project itself, but injecting spending power into the economy to boost national income via the multiplier effect.
So direct government spending is the key stimulus.
Right.
What about monetary policy, managing the money supply?
The sources suggest it's seen as less reliable, less effective, especially in a deep slump. Partly because investment might not respond much to lower interest rates anyway, and partly because of that liquidity trap problem where it becomes totally ineffective.
And the quantity theory of money?
Yeah.
MVPT, did Keynesians accept that?
No, the sources are clear. They rejected the simple classical version, the main reason. They saw velocity as unstable and unpredictable. Because money demand depends on interest rates and expectations, speculation, V can jump around. That instability breaks the direct link between M, money supply, and P, prices. Changes in M could affect real things, output, employment, especially in the short run. Money is definitely not neutral in the Keynesian short run.
Okay, so after Keynesianism dominated for a while, our sources bring us to monetarism, very closely linked with Milton Friedman. This really feels like a direct counter-argument to Keynes, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Monetarists put money right back at the center of the picture. Their core belief was that money is the most important factor driving the economy, and that economic instability, boons and busts, is mainly caused by erratic or poorly managed monetary policy from the central bank.
So they went back to the quantity theory, but maybe updated it?
Yes, they used what's called a modern quantity theory, often using the equation mv pi y, where y is real income or output. They saw money as an active asset, a store of wealth. But the crucial difference from Keynes was about velocity, v. While they didn't claim v was perfectly constant like the old classicals, they argued it was stable and predictable. It might change slowly or react to a few key things like interest rates or expected inflation, but in a pretty reliable way. Not wildly unstable like the Keynesians thought.
And if V is stable, what happens when the money supply M changes?
The sources emphasize a distinct pattern. Monetarists believe an increase in M affects nominal income, pi, fairly quickly. In the short term, this might involve a temporary boost to real output, y, because people might misinterpret price signals due to adaptive expectations.
Adaptive expectation.
Yeah, we'll get to that. But the key point is, in the long term, monetarists argue that changes in M only affect the price level P. Real output Y goes back to its natural level.
So like the classicals, money is neutral in the long run, but maybe not quite in the immediate short run.
Exactly. They even put rough timelines on it from their studies. Maybe 6-9 months for the effect on income, but 12-18 months or more for the full effect on prices to work through. Their bottom line: inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It happens when the money supply grows faster than the economy's real ability to produce.
You mentioned adaptive expectations. What does that mean? How do monetarists think people form expectations?
The sources explain it as people forming their expectations about the future, say inflation, based primarily on what's happened in the past. They learn from past errors and gradually adjust or adapt their expectations over time.
Okay.
This is why unexpected changes in the money supply can have those temporary real effects. People get caught off guard, maybe misjudge real wages or real interest rates for a bit before they eventually adapt their expectations to the new reality.
So how did this monetarist view influence their thinking on fiscal policy, government spending, and taxes?
They were pretty skeptical, as the sources note. Monetarists generally believed fiscal policy was largely ineffective, especially if the government borrows money to finance it.
Why?
Because of the crowding out effect. If the government borrows a lot, it increases the demand for loans, which pushes interest rates up. Higher interest rates make it more expensive for private businesses to invest and for consumers to buy big-ticket items. So government spending crowds out private spending.
Right.
Even if the spending is paid for by taxes, they argued it's mostly just shifting resources from the private sector to the public sector, with little net effect on overall demand. Money was the real driver.
What about that intriguing, almost ominous-sounding concept, unpleasant monetarist arithmetic?
Ah, yes, Sargent and Wallace. That's a fascinating and quite subtle argument. It basically says that if a government keeps running large budget deficits and financing them by borrowing year after year,
Uh-huh.
it might actually end up being more inflationary in the long run than if they had just printed some money to cover smaller deficits earlier on.
How does that work?
Because eventually, the debt can become unsustainable. The sources mention this happens particularly if the real interest rate on the debt is higher than the economy's real growth rate. At some point, the government might face a crisis where it has to print a massive amount of money just to avoid defaulting on its debt.
Right.
And that huge forced burst of money printing later on could cause way more inflation than a smaller, more controlled amount of money printing would have done earlier. It's unpleasant for monetarists because it suggests that in some really bad fiscal situations, the money printing they usually condemn might, paradoxically, be the less inflationary path compared to letting debt spiral out of control via borrowing.
Wow, that is a dilemma. So if money is the key driver, according to monetarists, what was their main policy advice?
Stability and predictability. They strongly argued against discretionary fine-tuning policies. Instead, they advocated for a fixed monetary rule. Yeah, like the central bank should commit to increasing the money supply by a constant pre-announced percentage each year, maybe matching the economy's long-run average real growth rate. The idea was to provide a stable monetary environment and avoid policy itself becoming a source of economic shocks.
Okay, let's move into some of the more recent debates our sources cover. The new classical school comes next.
Yeah.
How did they build on monetarism but also diverge, especially on that idea expectations?
The big leap, as the sources point out, was moving from adaptive expectations to rational expectations.
Rational expectations.
Yeah. Instead of just looking backward like adaptive expectations, rational expectations assumes that individuals use all available information, everything they know about the economy, about likely government policies, about how things work, to form the best possible forecast of the future. They look forward, they anticipate, they don't systematically make the same mistakes over and over.
And if people are that rational and forward-looking, what does that mean for government policy?
It leads to a pretty radical conclusion, according to the sources.
Okay.
The policy ineffectiveness proposition. Basically, any government policy that is systematic and predictable will have no effect on real economic outcomes like output or employment,
Not at all.
because rational agents will anticipate it.
Yeah.
If the central bank announces, we're going to increase the money supply by 5%, everyone rationally expects 5% inflation. They immediately adjust their wage demands, their pricing decisions, everything. Prices and nominal wages jump instantly, leaving real wages, real output, real employment exactly where they were. Only surprise policies or completely unexpected shocks can have a temporary real effect, just because people are momentarily fooled before their rational expectations adjust.
Wow. That view also seems to rely heavily on markets being perfectly flexible, doesn't it? Prices and wages adjusting instantly.
Right. Absolutely. New classical models typically assume perfectly flexible wages and prices, and that markets clear instantaneously. The economy is always assumed to be at its natural rate of output and employment, except for those brief moments when an unexpected shock hits and people make temporary forecast errors. Unemployment beyond the natural rate is just due to those errors.
But, the sources also raise questions about whether the real world actually works that way. Are people really that rational? Are markets that flexible?
Exactly.
Duh.
Critics jump on those points. Do people really have and perfectly process all information? Probably not. And are wages and prices really that fluid? Think about long-term labor contracts. Wages don't just leap up overnight, even if everyone expects inflation. Or think about restaurants printing new menus. There are costs and delays. These real-world frictions seem to contradict that perfect flexibility assumption.
And that critique, that stickiness, leads us right into the new Keynesian school, right? They seem to sort of blend the rational expectations idea with these real-world imperfections.
Precisely. New Keynesians often accept the idea that people might form expectations rationally, or at least try to. But they argue that the economy is full of nominal rigidities, reasons why wages and prices are sticky and don't adjust instantly, even if changes are anticipated.
What kind of reasons?
The sources list quite a few. Things like efficiency wages. Firms might pay workers more than the bare minimum market rate to motivate them and reduce turnover. There are implicit contracts, explicit long-term contracts, those menu costs of changing prices we just mentioned, coordination failures. Maybe no single firm wants to be the first to cut prices unless they know competitors will follow. And importantly, asymmetric information.
Asymmetric information. The sources mention the lemon problem in that context. What's that about?
Ah, yes, the used car market analogy. It's a classic example of how unequal information can mess up a market. If buyers can't easily tell a good used car, a peach, from a bad one, a lemon, they'll only be willing to offer an average price. But owners of the good cars know their car is worth more than average, so they might pull their cars from the market. This leaves mostly lemons, which drives the average quality and price down further, potentially leading to market failure.
Okay, so how does that apply to sticky prices or wages more broadly?
Well, the sources suggest similar problems can arise. If one side of a transaction has better information, it can lead to rigidities. For example, a firm might hesitate to cut wages even if business is slow, fearing it signals desperation and causes their best workers, who have better outside options, to quit. Or a firm might not lower prices even if costs fall. Worried customers might interpret the lower price as lower quality. These information gaps prevent the smooth, instant adjustments the new classicals assumed.
So because of all these sticky bits, menu cost, contracts, information problems, new Keynesians believe that unlike the new classicals, even predictable policies can have real effects on output and employment.
Yes, exactly. Even if a policy is fully anticipated, if wages and prices can't adjust immediately due to these rigidities, then the policy can still impact real variables in the short or medium term. The economy doesn't just instantly snap back to its natural level.
The sources also mention hysteresis in this context.
Right. That's the idea that a temporary shock, like a really bad recession that throws people out of work for a long time, might actually have permanent effects. It could permanently raise the natural rate of unemployment, maybe because worker skills decay or they become discouraged and stop looking for work altogether. The economy doesn't just bounce back perfectly.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. What about the supply side school? Their focus seems different again.
It is quite different. Supply-side economics is all about how government policies, especially taxes and regulations, but also things like transfer payments, affect people's incentives to work, save, invest, and take risks. It's focused on boosting the supply side, the productive capacity of the economy.
How do they view things like welfare or unemployment benefits?
The sources state that supply-siders often argue that overly generous transfer payments can reduce the financial incentive for people to work or seek training, which can hold back the economy's overall supply potential.
And the big one, tax cuts. That's almost synonymous with supply side, isn't it?
It certainly is a central theme. The core idea is that lowering marginal tax rates, the tax rate on the next dollar you earn or the next dollar of profit a company makes, increases the after-tax reward for productive activities.
Right.
So lower marginal rates should encourage people to work more hours, save more, invest more capital, start more businesses. This boosts supply, leads to faster growth, and potentially, according to the famous Laffer curve the sources mention, could even lead to higher total tax revenues if the initial tax rates were extremely high and discouraging activity.
But the sources also caution that it's not always that simple, right? Real-world tax cuts haven't always boosted revenue.
They do. The sources note that predicting exactly how much people will change their behavior in response to tax cuts is really difficult. And finding that sweet spot on the Laffer curve, where lower rates mean higher revenue, is, well, tricky in practice. Sometimes tax cuts just lead to bigger deficits. They also mention supply-siders generally reject the traditional Phillips curve idea of a trade-off between inflation and unemployment.
Okay, briefly, let's touch on public choice theory. What's the main idea there?
Public choice essentially applies the tools of economics, assuming rational, self-interested actors to the world of politics.
So politicians and voters acting like consumers and producers.
Kind of. It views voters, politicians, lobbyists, bureaucrats, all as individuals trying to maximize their own utility, whether it's getting reelected, increasing their agency's budget, or getting favorable regulations. Politics is seen as a process of exchange driven by self-interest, not necessarily some abstract public good.
And what's the main implication of looking at politics that way?
The sources suggest it leads to skepticism about whether government actions automatically serve the public interest. Because political actors have their own agendas, outcomes might reflect those interests rather than what's best for society overall. This often leads to calls for constitutional economics, setting up rules, like maybe a balanced budget requirement or a fixed monetary rule, to constrain the self-interested behavior of political actors and promote more stable, predictable policy.
Right. And finally, our sources mention real business cycle theory. What do they think causes economic ups and downs?
This theory kind of an extension of new classical ideas, argues that business cycles, booms, and recessions are primarily driven by real shocks to the economy, especially big changes in technology or productivity.
Technology
Yeah.
shocks.
A big technological breakthrough makes the economy more productive, leading to a boom. A negative shock may be a sudden energy price spike or a natural disaster that disrupts production, causes a downturn.
Mm.
It's all about real factors affecting the economy's ability to produce.
And do they assume markets are flexible in this view?
Yes, very much so. The sources state that real business cycle theory assumes wages and prices are fully flexible, even in the short run. Markets clear instantly. So the economy is always seen as being at its efficient, natural level of output. Recessions aren't market failures, they're just the economy's optimal response to a negative real shock.
So money must be neutral in this view, too.
Completely neutral, yes, both short run and long run. Monetary policy is considered totally ineffective at influencing real activity.
But what's really interesting, as the sources highlight, is their view on where the money supply even comes from.
Exactly. They often see the amount of money in circulation, especially bank deposits, as largely endogenous, meaning it's determined within the economic system by the interactions of banks and the public, rather than being solely controlled by the central bank.
How so?
For example, if a positive technology shock causes a real economic boom, businesses and consumers will want to make more transactions. They'll demand more loans and banking services. Banks respond by creating more credit and deposits. So the money supply increases because the real economy is booming. It's an effect, not a cause. Changes in this internal money don't really affect prices. Only changes in exogenous money, like physical cash printed by the central bank, might affect prices, but they don't drive the real business cycle.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a huge amount of ground there. From measuring wealth by hoarding gold to debating rational expectations and sticky prices, it's quite a journey through economic ideas.
It really is. You see this constant evolution, don't you? Each school kind of reacting to what they saw as the problems or unanswered questions of the previous one, often spurred on by major real-world events like the Great Depression really shaking things up.
And each one gives you a really different lens, a different set of assumptions about how the economy actually functions, what the government should or shouldn't do, what really drives prosperity or causes downturns.
Absolutely. Different tools for different ways of seeing the world.
So, thinking about all this, what does it mean for you listening today? When you hear economists or politicians arguing about inflation or interest rates or government spending, try to think, which of these historical perspectives might they be channeling?
Are they sounding like a classical economist worried about deficits? Or a Keynesian arguing for stimulus? Maybe a monetarist focused purely on the money supply? Or perhaps a new Keynesian pointing to market rigidities?
It helps you decode the debate a bit. And here's maybe a final thought to leave you with. If rational expectations theory suggests people anticipate and offset predictable policies, can any publicly announced policy truly be effective in changing real outcomes in the long run? Or is policy only powerful when it catches us by surprise? Makes you think, doesn't it?